introduction. I've seen a few Zoom webinars recently, and especially in America, the introduction can take anything from 5 to 15 minutes, and you're just wondering when the speaker's going to be allowed to speak. So my take on this issue of an introduction is that if you didn't know anything about Geoffrey Alderman, you wouldn't be here at all. So I'm going to take it that you've all Googled him, Wikipedia'd him, or whatever, to know what Geoffrey is about. And I'm sure that you've read him in the Jewish Chronicle or the Jewish Telegraph from Manchester. But I'm going to tell you something about him that I think none of you know, because you weren't in on the Catford talk this afternoon. And that is that Geoffrey is a licensed locomotive driver. You might want to expand upon that a little bit in a minute.
Steam locomotive.
Steam locomotive driver, and even better. So I'm going to curtail boring long introductions, and I'm going to say to Geoffrey, after Melvin Lippich has entered the room, that the floor is yours, and I'm now going to mute. Thank you very much, Geoffrey. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Richard. Can everyone hear me? I take silence as assent. I want to thank Richard and his colleagues for arranging this. I'm not sure whether this is the first ever virtual meeting of a branch of the Jewish Historical Society. It's certainly the first one that I've addressed. We are all living in a new world. We know that, having to get used to this technology. So let's be grateful that it exists. Richard, usually at the beginning of any lecture that I give, including university lectures, I say that I don't mind if people are so infuriated that they walk out, but could they walk out without disturbing anyone else? Of course, with this Zoom technology, it's easy to walk out. You just leave the meeting, but don't think that I'll take it personally, because I won't. In 1992, Oxford University published my book, Modern British Jewry. The volume may be regarded in some sense as a sequel to another book published by Oxford a half-century ago. I refer, of course, to the late Dr. Cecil Roth's History of the Jews in England, which first appeared in 1941 and which went into 3 editions. It's become fashionable now to dismiss this work. Professor David Katz has pointed out that Roth's writings in the field of Anglo-Jewish history were, quote, full of mistakes, undocumented assertions, and numerous gaps, unquote. So they were. It is the fate of all pioneers to have their mistakes uncovered by those who come after them and to have their theories cast aside. But ladies and gentlemen, to say these things is to miss the point. Yes, Roth's history was sanitized, apologetic, complacent. It stopped with emancipation in 1858, in part because Roth wished, for propaganda purposes, to end on a note of triumph. He felt uncomfortable dealing with the era of the great immigration of Jews to Britain in the 1880s and 1890s, and with the anti-Jewish prejudice in Britain, which this immigration triggered. As Professor Katz himself rightly observed, and I quote him again, Roth was a pioneer who worked very largely during the blackest era of Jewish history, when it seemed that the very last thing the Jews needed was avoidable criticism from within, supplying genuine arguments to even more genuine anti-Semites, unquote. 1941, Richard, was not a good year for the Jews. Roth, like so many other British Jews, did not know how to cope with the reality of the Holocaust. He adopted a then conventional explanation that the sufferings of the Jews were a test. He was right to contrast these sufferings, ordered by Nazi Germany, but carried out with the help of many other European nations, with the relative tranquility of the Jews in Britain. In Roth's view, here was a debt that had to be acknowledged and paid, and Roth saw it as a solemn duty to pay it. But even in so doing, he wrought a sea change in the researching and writing of British Jewish history. History is the collective memory of a people, and in large measure shapes their view of the present and of the future. That is why I devote some space in my book to the way in which Jews in Britain have approached and interpreted their past. Now, the first history of Anglo-Jewry to be written by an Anglo-Jewish writer appeared in 1847, a slim pamphlet published in Chambers Miscellany and written by a woman of Marano descent, Grace Aguilar. Jews, Grace declared, Jews are still considered aliens and foreigners, little known and less understood. Yet they are in fact Jews only in their religion, Englishmen in everything else. And she went on to say, and I'm still quoting her, a Jewish murderer, adulterer, burglar, or even petty thief is actually unknown. Actually unknown? We may smile at the sweeping superficiality and patent dishonesty of such a statement. There were plenty of Jewish criminals in Britain in the 1830s and 1840s, and I find it difficult to believe that Aguilar did not know something about them. Criminality among the Jewish poor obsessed the communal grandees at this time. The dramatic escape from police custody in 1827 of Ike Solomons, on whom Dickens is thought by some to have modelled Fagin. Ike Solomons, actually, in Oliver Twist, Dickens' novel, in Oliver Twist, Fagin, the Jewish fence and supplier of little boys, is hanged. But Ike Solomons jumped over the dock at the Magistrates' Court in 1827 and escaped to Hobart, Tasmania. The next time any of you are in Hobart, Tasmania, do visit the Ike Solomons Museum. Or the trial of Sol Litzenberg, indicted at Marlborough Street Court in 1830 for running a gang of 20 juvenile thieves in Leicester Square. Or the scandals which arose from cases of Jewish-run houses of easy virtue, condemned by Ashkenazi Chief Rabbi Herschel in public condemnation of Jewish-run brothels in 1836. The Jewish fence, dealing in stolen property, was a feature of Petticoat Lane Market throughout the mid-Victorian period, and its eradication was felt by many of the lay leaders of British Jewry to be an essential prerequisite of full political emancipation. Indeed, there was a plan, never carried out, that the lessees of market stalls in Petticoat Lane Market would be bought out, and the market, but by the Jewish grandees, and the market would be shut down. Considerations of image obsessed the leadership then, just as considerations of image obsess the leadership now. Historians were expected to play their part in maintaining this image intact. In 1993, the Jewish Historical Society of England celebrated its centenary. It's worth recalling, ladies and gentlemen, that the notion of establishing a society devoted to Anglo-Jewish history was viewed with not a little misgiving, and that those who established it and who supported its establishment were at pains to justify its existence in terms of the good account it would give to the Gentiles of the Jewish people. In his inaugural address to the society, the journalist Lucian Wolff, its first president, gave this assurance. Wolff wrote extensively on Anglo-Jewish historical themes, concentrating upon the period of the resettlement and writing in the style of an earlier generation of Anglo-Jewish historians, principally Maya Davis and James Picciotto, whose work in the 1870s forms the bridge, so to speak, between Grace Aguilar and Lucian Wolff himself. Cecil Roth learnt his craft from Lucian Wolff, to whom he referred in adulatory terms in his, that's Cecil's last address to the Jewish Historical Society in 1968, 2 years before his death. Roth felt the weight of this responsibility very heavily and very personally, but he gave to the researching and writing of Jewish history a scholastic base which it had not had hitherto. As the late Professor Lloyd Gartner observed, and I'm quoting Lloyd, Jewish history as a profession virtually did not exist during the 1920s, when Roth made that fateful decision to turn from the history of Renaissance Italy, that's what he did his Oxford doctorate in, to that of Italian Jewry and then of Anglo-Jewry. The researching and writing of Anglo-Jewish history had hitherto been the preserve of non-scholastic apologists like Grace Aguilar and Lady Magnus, gifted amateurs like Maya Davis and Lucian Wolfe, and ministers of religion who, as Roth himself observed, regarded Jewish history almost as a branch of theology. Cecil Roth single-handedly transformed Anglo-Jewish history into a scholarly activity worthy of pursuit at the highest levels. British Jewry recognised his achievements and marked them. The readership in post-biblical Jewish history, which he held at Oxford from 1939 to 1964, was created for him through a communal benefaction, but he had to sing, so to speak, for his supper. Approached by the then president of the Federation of Synagogues, the crook and racketeer Maury Davis, to write the Federation's Jubilee history in 1937, Roth was obliged to pen what can only be described as a pamphlet, so superficial and wanting in scholastic rigour that he was too ashamed to include it in the list of his own publications. It is, I think, well known that the celebratory centenary history of the Jewish Chronicle, which appeared in 1949, was written by Roth, but he was so ashamed of it that he would not permit his name to appear on its title page. I was a student of Cecil Roth. I went up to Oxford in 1962 and Roth retired from Oxford in 1964. I was a student of his and I remain an admirer, but I am in no sense an imitator, less still a disciple. Disciples and imitators there certainly were. Foremost among these were Albert Hyamson, who died in 1954, and Vivian Lippmann, who died in 1990. Albert Hyamson's History of the Sephardim in England, which appeared in 1951, was written very much in the Roth mould, apologetic, highly selective, uncritical. The volume was meant to cover the 2 centuries 1492 to 1951. In fact, precisely 20 pages in a work of over 460 were devoted to the 20th century, and much was left unsaid into the bargain. For example, the controversial reign of Moses Gaster as Chacham, that is, supreme rabbinical authority of the Spanish and Portuguese Jews Congregation of London from 1887 to 1918, was totally unexplored. Nothing was said, that is, about the man who was Theodore Herzl's staunchest and earliest ally in Britain. Indeed, Herzl spent his first ever night in England in the house of Moses Gaster in Hampstead. Hyamson's excuse for all these omissions, and I quote him, was, "The historian ought never to deal or attempt to deal with events of which he has a personal knowledge," unquote. This excuse strikes me as lame indeed, but it was an excuse which Roth himself had proffered more than once to explain his own reluctance to deal with 20th century problems. The late Vivian Lippmann was a pupil of Roth and a disciple in every sense of the word. As is, I think, well known, Lippmann was a distinguished civil servant who rose to become Director of Ancient Monuments and Historic Buildings at the Department of the Environment. He was an expert on medieval Jewry, in some respects an expert than his teacher, Cecil Roth, but he was also more establishment-minded than his teacher, willing to carry favour with the communal grandees, even if this meant being economical with the truth. For example, When the then Jewish Board of Guardians, founded in 1859, decided to commission a centenary history, Vivian Lippmann was not their first choice. They turned initially to a young Anglo-Jewish academic, an objective scholar in every sense of the word. This young man produced a chapter for the consideration of the grandees. They were horrified, for he had told the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. That man, incidentally, was the late Dr. Lionel Cochin, who became Bierstead Reader in Jewish history at Warwick University. The commission was taken from Lionel and given to Vivian Lippmann instead. And the work which Vivian Lippmann published in 1959 is distinguished chiefly by its meticulous attention to detail, its highly descriptive approach, and its signal failure to explore, let alone explain, the abominable treatment by the Jewish Board of Guardians of Jewish refugees to Britain at the end of the 19th century. Lippmann's last book, his History of the Jews in Britain since 1858, was published posthumously a few months after his death. The bulk of the work was devoted to the period 1858 to 1939. Precisely 15 pages address the post-1945 period. The treatment throughout is descriptive, uncritical, highly selective, and outrageously partial. Let me give a few examples. When Russian persecution and economic hardship drove millions of Jews westwards in the 1880s and 1890s, the communal leadership did its best to prevent any but the most affluent of them from ever settling permanently in Britain. To this policy, Lippmann accorded just 3 inadequate sentences. In the 1930s, a not dissimilar policy was invoked to hinder the entry into Britain of refugees from Nazism. Vivian hinted darkly at this, but on the whole peddled the now discredited apologia of Norman Bentwich in Bentwich's book They Found Refuge, published in 1956, whose defense of Otto Schiff, the man whom the Home Office trusted to select the right type of German Jew to be permitted to enter Britain, has crumbled as archival material of which Lippmann, I know, was well aware, has become available for public inspection. Nor, except in terms of unashamed bias and lack of professionalism, is it possible to explain the complete absence in Lippmann's book of any allusion to the stratagems devised by the leadership of the United Synagogue, particularly Sir Robert Whaley-Cohen, in the interwar period to prevent Zionism becoming official United Synagogue policy. It is, incidentally, worth remarking that the official historian of the United Synagogue, Professor Aubrey Newman of Leicester University, was himself strangely silent on this subject. I should add that the late Professor David Cesarani did his Oxford D. Phil thesis on Zionism and was the first historian to reveal the stratagems to which Sir Robert Whaley-Cohen adopted in order to prevent Zionism becoming official United Synagogue policy. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it would be comforting to think that we've heard the last of the Whig historians of Anglo-Jewry, whose writings have been characterized as apologetic, sanitized, triumphant, uncritical, even cozy, as the word used by Professor Todd Endelman. I fear not, for as recently as 3.5 years ago, I was asked to referee for a commercial publishing house a manuscript in which all these hallmarks appear in ample measure, as if the revolution of the past 40 years in Anglo-Jewish historiography had not taken place. Incidentally, ladies and gentlemen, I recommended against the publication of this limp manuscript, but of course my recommendation was ignored. I'm proud to think that I played a part in that revolution, but I was not its prime mover. It cannot be without significance that the scholar who broke the mold of what had passed for Anglo-Jewish historiography hitherto, the late Professor Lloyd Gartner, was an American, a pupil of the great Salo Baron. Gartner's monograph, The Jewish Immigrant in England, first appeared in 1960. His view of the immigrants in the period 1870 to 1914 was that at bottom they had much less in common with the non-Jewish manual working classes amongst whom they dwelt than with the Jewish bourgeoisie to whose life and status they aspired. It's a view that has come under serious challenge, notably from Dr. Joseph Buckman in relation to Leeds Jewry, and Professor David Feldman and the late Professor William Fishman, whose use of Yiddish sources has surely set new standards for the study of the Anglo-Jewish proletariat. My own view, incidentally, is that both sides of the argument are right. In the short term, immigrants had to confront life as they found it. This meant that they had to meet and make friends with the British proletariat, of which perforce they became a part. But we must remember that many of the Anglo-Jewish immigrants who came to this country in states of penury had in fact been members of a petty bourgeoisie in Russia, Poland, Galicia, and Romania. Their undoubted motivation for self-improvement derived in part from their ambition to recapture in Britain the status they had lost in Eastern Europe. The average British trade unionist saw his or her life as beginning and ending in a working class milieu. This was not a vision shared by Anglo-Jewish trade unionists. The major impact of the immigrants is to be found in the challenge they mounted to the rule of the so-called cousinhood, that small group of interrelated moneyed families which affected to rule Anglo-Jewry in the age of emancipation. It's become fashionable to contrast the process of emancipation in Britain with that on the European mainland, where Jewish communities often had to undergo a formal renunciation of their separate ethnic and often internally self-governing status. As individual Jews, they were offered absolute equality before the law, that is, but only on condition that communal rights were severely delimited. On the face of it, no such demand was ever made of the Jews in Britain. In fact, we would be very wrong to conclude from the absence of a formal emancipation contract, so to speak, that no concessions were extracted from British Jewry in return for the grant of civic rights. Emancipation, which Cecil Roth saw as the triumphant culmination of the Jewish existence in Britain, was bought at a very considerable cost, no more so than in the religious sphere. For example, it was no coincidence that Reformed Jews were to be found at the very forefront of the emancipation struggle, actually arguing in a petition to Sir Robert Peel, the Prime Minister in 1845, that emancipation should be granted as a reward for reform of the synagogue service to make it somewhat less Jewish and more English in form. Another example is provided by the status in English law of a rabbinically sanctioned divorce. When the Matrimonial Causes Act was passed in 1857, it was assumed that the hitherto undisputed freedom of the Jews to dissolve marriages contracted under rabbinical auspices would continue. But then another argument was heard. If the Jews wanted equality before law, so be it, in every sphere. So the supremacy of the civil divorce court over the Beth Din was established. And I do wonder sometimes, Richard, how much less intractable would have been more recent difficulties over Jewish divorce had this form of equality not been imposed. The generation of the emancipation wished for nothing better than to be accepted by the host society as Britons of the Jewish persuasion. The immigrants mounted a sustained challenge to this assimilatory view by insisting upon the preservation of their ethnic identity and worse still, parading it for all to see. For some, this ethnic separatism took a religious form, the establishment of the Federation of Synagogues in 1887 and of the Union of Orthodox Hebrew Congregations in 1926. For others, it took a political form, the formation of Jewish trade unions and of a uniquely Jewish species of socialism and labourism. For still others, it took a cultural form, the maintenance of a rich Yiddish culture, theatre and newspapers, and for others still, it took a geopolitical form, the assertion of provincial autonomy and rebellion against the rule of the London grandees. All these discontents were exploited by the Zionists, who until the 1930s were really a very small band operating, if not on the periphery of the Anglo-Jewish world, then certainly at a remarkable distance from its centre. Our view of the Zionist dimension in Anglo-Jewish history has been transformed through the researches of Professor Stuart Cohen of Bar-Ilan University and the late, much lamented Professor David Cesarani of Royal Holloway University of London. It is, I fear, still but little understood now how very fashionable anti-Zionism was within British Jewry before 1939. The Zionist view was that the emancipation of the Jews in Europe had failed and was destined to fail, because at the end of the day, the argument went, the Jews were simply not capable of assimilation within European societies. This was precisely the view of the Nazis. The established Jewish communities in Britain, obsessively anxious to maintain the image of British Jewry totally at one with its British environment, opposed both Zionism and Nazism for the same reason. And so we encounter and enter upon one of the blackest phases of British Jewish history, the reaction of British Jews to fascism at home and to Nazism abroad. As to the former, fascism at home, in respect of which our knowledge has been immeasurably transformed by Professor Colin Holmes of Sheffield University, the world's leading authority on anti-Jewish prejudice in Britain, by his pupil, Professor Tony Kushner, and by my pupil, Dr. Thomas Linehan, now of Brunel University. It is clear now that the community, certainly as represented by the Board of Deputies of British Jews, was concerned less about protecting Jews from Gentiles than about protecting Gentiles from Jews. That is, the board, in its communal defence policy, acted and accepted upon the view, accepted and acted upon the view that Jews, by their behaviour, fostered the work of Dr. Louise London, whose London University doctoral thesis I was privileged to examine, and also to the work of my own postgraduate student, Mrs. Paula Hill. I do believe that in the immediate post-war period, and aided particularly by the euphoria generated by the re-establishment of the Jewish state so soon after the catastrophe of the Holocaust, there developed within British Jewry a collective amnesia, the guilt of those who survived, perhaps, about the precise nature of its own reaction to the news of the final solution and to the plight of its Jewish victims. All I wish to say here is that I trust I've not disappointed those many Jewish fugitives from Nazism who hoped to find a welcome from their British co-religionists, whose hopes were brutally dashed, and who have waited for over half a century, 3/4 of a century, for the truth to be told. I have stressed that the preservation of image has been at the uttermost priority of the Anglo-Jewish leadership throughout the ages. In my book, Modern British Jewry, and its sequel, British Jewry Since Emancipation, published by the University of Buckingham Press in 2014, I attempt to show how very divided the Jewish communities have been since the disappearance of the self-discipline imposed by the Holocaust years. The last chief rabbi who could truly claim to speak as the religious head of the Jews in Britain was Dr. Joseph Herman Hertz, who held the office from 1913 to 1946. Hertz had problems coping with the left, so to speak, the reform and liberal movements, and from the right, the Union of Orthodox Hebrew Congregations and the Gateshead community. But in the shadow of the Nazi menace, the various factions tacitly agreed to sink their differences. Under his successor, Israel Brody, the fabric of religious unity so carefully constructed by the Adlers, father and son, during the 19th century began to fall apart. And during the tenure of office of his successor, Brodie's successor, Lord Jacobowitz, the fabric was rent asunder. As I say in British Jewry Since Emancipation, Jacobowitz bequeathed to Rabbi Dr. Jonathan Sacks, his successor, I quote myself, an office less recognized throughout Jewish Britain than at any time since the emancipation. Even before Sacks' election as the suzerainty of the chief rabbinate had been publicly repudiated by the Federation of Synagogues, the Union of Liberal and Progressive Synagogues, and the Assembly of Conservative Synagogues. Subsequently, it was repudiated also by the Reformed Synagogues of Great Britain. It had never been recognized by the Union of Orthodox Hebrew Congregations or by the Spanish and Portuguese Jews. Professor Barry Kosmin, then director of the research unit of the Board of Deputies, calculated in 1982 that the communities and congregations which acknowledged the authority of Jacobowitz amounted to only 62% of synagogue members in the UK as a whole, and to only 53% in London. The proportions over whom Dr. Sacks could claim authority were certainly smaller, and diminished still further to barely 50% in the early years of the new millennium. In my books, I try to explain how and why this has happened, but I also emphasize that it is a development parallel to and not unconnected with a similar loss of prestige, status, and ultimately authority suffered by the Board of Deputies of British Jews. In times gone by, the wealthy within British Jewry played their part and took their place in the circles of the board. That past is dead. There is now a more or less wholesale divorce between those who claim to speak as the representatives of British Jewry and those who control its purse strings, some of whom have of course defected to the upstart Jewish Leadership Council. The board is also a victim of the religious polarization of Anglo-Jewry. It cannot claim to speak on behalf of the secular Jews, nor on behalf of the sectarian Orthodox, represented by and through the union, which walked out of the board literally, I mean that literally, led by Joe Lobenstein, Holy Joe Lobenstein. They walked out of the board in 1971, and they have shown not the slightest desire of wanting to return. The board has tried to paper over these fissures, but in so doing has been driven to ever more desperate memories. The truth was and is bound to get out in the end. During the very bitter controversy between the board and the chief rabbinate on the one hand, and a loose alliance of Orthodox synagogal groupings led by the Spanish and Portuguese Jews, the Union and the Federation on the other, over the protection of Shechita in the late 1980s, the claim of the board to somehow represent British Jewry was effectively quashed. It is now nothing more than a gigantic bluff. In some respects, it's true that the publication of Professor Gartner's Jewish Immigrant in England proved to be a false dawn. Why was this? In the first place, we must remember that this work came from the pen of an American scholar, thoroughly at home with the Hebrew and Yiddish sources as well as the English, and free from the subtle inhibitions of somewhat less subtle communal constraints that obtained in the United Kingdom. In the second, whereas the American university world was glad to offer homes to young scholars who had served their academic apprenticeships within the world of Jewish history and more generally of Jewish studies, no such opportunities existed at that time in the United Kingdom. Outside of the universities of Oxford, Cambridge and London, Jewish history was hardly taught, and where it was taught, it was likely to be only within departments of theology, classics and ancient history. Happily, this is no longer the case. Modern Anglo-Jewish history has benefited from the increasing interest in ethnic studies, whatever that might mean, and in the experience and impact of other immigrant minorities to Britain. British Jewry itself has matured. It is now no longer reluctant to confront its recent past. Scarcely less important has been the willingness of communal philanthropists to fund university posts in and university level research into this recent past. In my writings, I have built on the foundations dug by others, therefore. But the building is mine, and I'm responsible for its faults and imperfections. With whatever shortcomings its detractors may find fault, it is my child, and I shall extend to it the full measure of my protection. Some of you may be smiling and wondering why does Geoffrey speak in these terms? I choose my words carefully, and I voice them with good reason. Any professional historian working today in the field of British Jewish history knows that he or she walks in a minefield, and that the assertion of too independent a judgment can bring down communal wrath in full measure. I well recall someone asked earlier, why did I refer to it as the Jewish Hysterical Society? I well recall how in the spring of 1989, my satisfaction in accepting an invitation from the Jewish Historical Society to deliver a paper to it was rudely interrupted when the then program committee of the society expressed its displeasure on learning that I proposed to talk on the career of Maury Davis, the aforementioned racketeer, one of the most important figures in Labour politics and political corruption in Stepney between the two world wars. Their objection appears to have been not that I would say things about Davis that were untrue or could not be supported by the evidence, but that what I would say would be only too true. I stood my ground, the programme committee backed off, and the paper was delivered and printed. In the inaugural University of London professorial lecture, which I was privileged to give following my elevation to a personal chair at Royal Holloway College in 1989, I drew attention to this incident, but omitted to cite another far graver, which had occurred but a few months previously. I had wished to examine a particular archive of the Board of Deputies. Because of its anti-Semitic nature, I well understood the sensitivity of the board on this matter, which I had raised as a deputy on the floor of the board. When, therefore, in October 1986, the then president of the board, Dr. Lionel Koplowitz, wrote offering me access to this archive on conditions which included an undertaking that I would not divulge anything from this archive without the prior permission of the president, I readily assented. This agreement, as come to in October 1986, was never carried out. A series of bureaucratic and other obstacles was placed in the way of its implementation until in May 1988, it was made clear to me by Dr. Koplowitz that access to this archive would depend not merely upon my adhering to conditions to which I'd already agreed, but also upon my agreeing to other new conditions which had nothing remotely to do with the archive itself, but which pertained to my role and profile in a quite different communal matter. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, my access to the archive was now dependent upon my keeping my mouth shut on a current matter then of great communal interest and importance. Was there ever, I wonder, such pressure put upon a professional historian working in the field of Anglo-Jewish history as was put upon me at that time? And could there, I wonder, be a more perfect example of the contempt in which British Jews, at least as represented by the board, hold those who seek the truth of its history? Throughout all these and other trials and tribulations, I was constantly assailed by members of Anglo-Jewry. I was told to be careful what I wrote and how I wrote it. I was enjoined to present Anglo-Jewry in a favourable light. I was told not to say anything that might be used as ammunition by anti-Semites. I replied, and I reply as follows. If, as I sit in front of my laptop, my constant intent is not to write anything that may be used by the detractors of the Jewish people, then the detractors have already thereby won a victory. That is not a victory I propose or have ever proposed to give them. I recall and commend some words penned by one of the greatest novelists and poets to write in the English language, Thomas Hardy. In his explanatory note to the first edition of his great novel, Tess of the D'Urbervilles, written in November 1891, Thomas Hardy felt it prudent to remind his audiences of some words of St. Jerome. I repeat them now, and I've no qualms about doing so, since I follow the maxim of the late Chief Rabbi Hertz, who enjoined his fellow Jews to accept the truth from whatever source it comes. And the context for Hertz's statement was that in his edition of the Chumash, the Hertz Chumash, he quoted non-Jewish sources as well as Jewish. The words of St. Jerome, quoted by Thomas Hardy, run thus: if an offence come out of the truth, better is it that the offence come than that the truth be concealed. Thank you very much.
Well, that was a rousing peroration, Geoffrey, for which many thanks. Now, questions. There's two ways that you can get my attention. One is to put a note, is to hover your cursor over chat and to send me a note saying you'd like to ask me a question. And the second one is to move the cursor over the smiley button that says reactions so that you can wave. I think that would be easier than me just having to see people who are actually waving at me. So who would like to go first? If you could wave on where it says reactions or send me a note, I'll ask someone if they'd like to go first. Anyone?
Total silence.
Well, I'll ask the first question in that case. All right. Let's go to Brenda. I've unmuted Brenda, I think.
Speaking.
Right. Okay.
Your assertion at the end of your speech there that the truth's got to come out. In Jewish biblical history, right throughout all our biblical texts, we see Jews, our kings and our leaders and everything, warts and all. So I agree wholeheartedly with what you're saying, because that history has stayed, we have stayed with the truth.
No, I entirely agree. As recently as 2 years ago, I was asked to interest myself in the case of a Jewish postgraduate research student who was and is doing research on the reception and settlement in this country of Jewish refugees from Nazism, particularly in the kinder transport. And she has uncovered absolutely incontrovertible evidence of sexual abuse. And she was being given a very, very, very tough time by certain interests in Anglo-Jewry who did not want this evidence to come out. It's very sad.
Thank you. Right, David Newman, if you'd like to unmute. Yes.
Yeah.
Please don't make this question intellectual.
I never do, Geoffrey, but we just... you mentioned, as is well known, that in the pre-war years, the establishment community, the Whaley Cohens and the Montagues, were actually quite anti-Zionist. And what's interesting, of course, is some of the Haredi Rabbonim of the time, who today you associate with anti-Zionism, actually were very Zionist, people like Hillman and Rabinowitz and so on. What do you think was the transition that brought the community around? Was it the Holocaust? Was it the establishment of the State of Israel? If I read correctly, then even Rabbi Brody, it took him quite some time to come round to supporting Israel. At the beginning, he too was not really the greatest supporter. Well, what do you think was this transition phase?
I think the transition phase was the Holocaust, or rather the news from 1942 onwards of what the Holocaust, which we now call the Holocaust, actually meant. You're quite right about Brodie. His predecessor Hertz was a Zionist, but the Zionism of Hertz and other Zionists was a Zionism which they sought to portray Zionism as an extension of their loyalty to the British state. It was Britain was the mandatory power in Palestine under the technically the mandatory authority of the League of Nations, and their Zionism was seen as a support for British imperial interests in the Eastern Mediterranean. That was how they rationalized and sold, if you like, their Zionism. But it's well known that the United Synagogue under Whaley Cohen, whilst I wouldn't characterize it as anti-Zionism, it was certainly non-Zionist. And the man who held the presidency of the Board of Deputies until 1940, throughout most of the 1930s, was of course the barrister Neville Lasky, who was extremely unenthusiastic about Zionism. To be too enthusiastic about Zionism was to question one's loyalty to the British state. This is why, of course, when the Balfour Declaration was issued, some of the cousinhood took absolute fright. They were in genuine panic. They formed the League of British Jews in order to assert that they were Britons of the Jewish persuasion. They had no national ambitions. Self-determination for Jews was a dangerous joke as far as they were concerned. And their view was what's been called a patriotic Zionism, what David Cesarani called patriotic Zionism. That only changed with news of the Holocaust. And in relation to the Holocaust, there was an uncomfortably long period between first news of the Holocaust and its confirmation by I think the Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden in the House of Commons, and Anglo-Jewry coming round to a Zionist view. It took a long time. It was not assisted, I have to say this, because one must accept the truth from whatever source it comes. It was not assisted by the antics in Britain, in England, of Zionist terrorists. And of course, David Cesarani has written a book about Captain Farron. There was a Zionist cell operating actively in Britain. They sent, Farron had been one of the most decorated British Army officers of the Second World War, had been complicit in the torture and death of a 16-year-old Palestinian Jewish boy. And the Zionist cell, terrorist cell operating in Britain, sent him a parcel bomb to his home in central England, not realizing that he had a brother, there was Rex Farron and Roy Farron, and it was the wrong Farron that opened the parcel bomb and got blown up. Not much comfort. And there were other incidents. If that was the most dramatic, it certainly wasn't the only one. And then, of course, the hanging of the two sergeants and so on. Professor Newman knows his history, I'm sure, better than me. It took a long time for Anglo-Jewry en masse, if one can use that term, to come round to a broadly sympathetic view of the Zionist movement. And when they did come round, Zionism was not for British Jews. There was no Holocaust here. It was for other Jews, not for British Jews.
I've got a question from Jemima Jarman with regard to the influence that evangelical missionaries had on the East End Jews at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. Can you give us some reflections on that?
You're talking to me?
Yes, Geoffrey. About the missionaries, the evangelical missionaries.
Well, of course, the missionaries saw that they had their operatives waiting at the dockside and at Fenchurch Street railway station on the London, Tilbury and Southend Railway when the immigrants were brought from their ships at boats at Tilbury into the heart of the East End of London. The evangelical Christians were interested in converting the Jews to Christianity, and they went about their way very methodically. But I do commend to you a chapter on the missionaries in the late Bill Fishman's book, East End 1888. Because 1888 was the year of the Ripper murders. And Bill Fishman there gives a table compiled by one of the missionary societies of how much money you actually had to invest to get a non-Jew to convert, to get a non-Christian to convert to Christianity. And at the top of the list came the Jews. It was extremely expensive to convert a Jew to Christianity. And what is more, there were Jewish professional converts. They went from one town to the other, talking about the 1880s and 1890s. They went from one town to another, from London to Manchester, Birmingham, Leicester, and so on, reconverting each time. Because each time they converted, they got a small, stipend for converting. So it was just business to them. Having said that, some of the Christian evangelicals, very active in England in the 19th century, were what I would, they were anti-Semitic. A great deal was made during the emancipation controversy, the years, let's say 1830 to 1860, by a speech of Thomas Babington Macaulay in the House of Commons when the first Emancipation Bill was defeated. Macaulay was hailed as a great Philo-Semite. But if you read that speech carefully, what Macaulay was saying is, why on earth should we deny the right to vote and sit in Parliament to Jews? They're so rich and so wealthy, they own us anyway. That was Macaulay. I'm paraphrasing, of course, Macaulay's view.
A double-edged insult. Right, can I move to Zev Portner, please? I saw him waving before.
Yeah.
Would you like to introduce yourself as a fellow Buckinghamite to Geoffrey?
Yeah, Geoffrey, I interviewed you many years ago about my dissertation on Black-Jewish relations many years ago in your house.
Was my advice any good?
Very helpful. I quoted you. I teach law at one of your fellow universities, Buckinghamshire New University.
Oh, that's Buckinghamshire New University.
Yeah, not where you are.
Not the University of Buckingham.
No, that's right. We're in different places. Anyway,
yes. You're at High Wycombe.
That's right.
Yes,
That's what I'm saying. Just a quick couple of points. Since the age of 16, this is just slightly off field. I've been an avid reader of the Jewish Chronicle every week since the age of 16. I'm just wondering.
You've been an avid reader of the Jewish Chronicle?
Yeah, since the age of 16.
God almighty.
I still read it. I'm just wondering, over the years, has there been a number of historical figures who've written for the JHSE? I'm just wondering if you'd comment on that. And the other thing I was thinking about, obviously the JHSE's been around since 1841. And obviously Benjamin Disraeli, for example, had a good relationship with Lord Rothschild. Is there a possibility that Disraeli himself may have read the JHSE on occasion? And my final question is, what do you think? You used to be used to write a weekly column for the JHSE. What do you think is the future for the JHSE in the 21st century? Thank you very much.
How many hours do I have to answer these questions?
Well, I don't want to take up everyone's time. So,
let me answer the middle question first. I simply don't know whether Benjamin Disraeli read the Jewish Chronicle. I imagine, but this is pure supposition on my part, that he read it from time to time, or that various reports from time to time were drawn to his attention. We do know that when he was Prime Minister, it was Disraeli's custom to walk home from the House of Commons on a Friday and to hide himself in one of the dark courtyards surrounding the synagogue of Bevis Marks, because he used to like to hear the Kabbalah Shabbos melodies he remembered from his youth. It's quite a touching fact about Benjamin Disraeli. Benjamin Disraeli never for 1 minute denied his Jewish origins. On the contrary, he was very proud of them. Although the criticism that's often made of him, well, what part did he play in the Jewish emancipation controversy? The first professing Jew to sit in the House of Commons was not, of course, Lionel de Rothschild in 1858. It was Sir David Salomons in 1851. David Salomons was the first professing Jew to sit in the House of Commons. David Salomons got himself elected as a Liberal MP in a by-election in Greenwich in 1851. He strode up to the Speaker and took the oath of abjuration, abjuring the Stuart line to the throne, omitting the words, quote, "on the true faith of a Christian," unquote, and then sat down and voted in 3 divisions on his own expulsion. He was then bodily kicked down the steps of the House of Commons by the Sergeant at Arms. But much more seriously, he was adjudged guilty of the treasonable act of praemunire, about what we would now say very roughly was contempt of Parliament. And this meant that anyone could kill David Salomons and not only would not be indicted, but would be celebrated as a public benefactor. Very dangerous. It was Disraeli in 1852, who was a member of a short-lived minority Tory government, who steered through both houses of Parliament at breakneck speed a bill absolving David Salomons of any criminal penalties as a result of him having voted in 3 divisions on his own expulsion. Now, that is a long-winded explanation to one of your questions. I want to go back to the first of your questions. Can you remind me of the precise terms of that question?
Yeah, obviously over the years, the JHSE's been around since 1841.
Oh, yes.
It's had, I presume it's had many famous people written for the JHSE. Was it Churchill who wrote, or which kind of famous people written for the JHSE over the years?
Theodor Herzl's great pamphlet that launched the political Zionist movement was in fact originated as an article commissioned by the Jewish Chronicle. And of course, Winston Churchill did write for most British prime ministers since David Lloyd George, at the time of the Balfour Declaration, have written for the Jewish Chronicle. When the Jewish Chronicle began in 1841, it was by no means the only Anglo-Jewish newspaper. There were several rivals, particularly a newspaper called The Voice of Jacob, and later on another newspaper which the Jewish Chronicle bought called The Jewish World. But one by one, it happened to swallow them up. The Jewish Chronicle under the Greenbergs, particularly Leopold Greenberg in the 1940s, had a confrontational relationship with the Anglo-Jewish establishment, particularly over Zionism. And it was not afraid at that time. It had been, if anything, in the 1890s anti-Zionist, but by that time it swung to the opposite extreme. Your third question, remind me of the precise...
What do you think is the future of the JHSE in the 21st century?
What is the future? Listen, I gave a lecture on that this afternoon. I am a political scientist, not a prophet.
Yes.
You know, print journalism has been going down the tubes throughout the world. And sooner or later, this decline was going to catch up with the Anglo-Jewish newspapers. But the straw that broke the camel's back was, of course, the virus, the dreaded virus, and the cancellation of hotels, of foreign tours, Pesach bookings in Israel or Florida or whatever. And this has knocked the stuffing out of all the Jewish newspapers. The Jewish Chronicle has now been rescued by a rather strange consortium. We'll simply have to see how well it can do. There are only a handful of Anglo-Jewish newspapers. The Jewish Telegraph in Manchester really has a niche, a provincial newspaper with a strong following in the northeast and northwest of England, and the Anglo-Yiddish newspaper, the Jewish Tribune, has a niche market because it has the Yiddish-speaking Haredi communities. So in that sense, perhaps they can comfort themselves, but I wouldn't, if I were them, I wouldn't comfort myself too cozily that they have a secure future. I don't personally think that any print newspaper has a secure future. The future lies in the internet. I, for example, read, and this is not a boast, I read about 12 newspapers a day. But I only do that, of course I don't buy the print editions, I do that through the internet. It makes it very easy. That's the future of the Anglo-Jewish newspaper industry.
Can I butt in with a very short comment? I don't want to prevent other people asking questions. But in looking at the Jewish archives, when I was last in London, the British Library, in the 1920s and 30s, there used to be a number of Jewish newspapers. One was called the Jewish Graphic. And I came across an amazing advertisement in the Graphic one day, which, if I can read just 2 or 3 sentences of it, it says, "Our challenge to our contemporaries, having been reported to us on good authority, that canvassers attached to other Jewish papers have been attacking the circulation figures of the Jewish Graphic. We challenge other Anglo-Jewish papers to publish with us figures of their paid weekly sales, numbers of copies distributed. This challenge is in no way in the nature of an attack, etc., etc. The Jewish Graphic is a real life force in all sections of the community," and it goes on. So what it shows is that, as the Hebrew phrase says, "Ein chadash tachat hashemesh."
Yes.
What comes round, what goes round comes round.
Yes, quite right.
I'd like to, well, first of all, when you've had enough, Geoffrey, would you just say Shoin Ganig or whatever the Chinese is?
You can never have enough Lefroy. Cheers.
Because I think we're hanging on to your every word, and of course, if anybody's had enough, they can just slink off without your even knowing. But we've still got 30 participants, which is pretty good. I really like your pen portrait, so I wonder if you can give us a little portrait about Edwin Montagu, who of course was the king of the anti-Zionists, and it was very much due to Edwin Montagu that the Balfour Declaration was watered down. For example, instead of Palestine being the national home for the Jewish people were to be given a home in Palestine. And so on, and also having regard to nothing to prejudice the rights of the Palestinians. So were it not for he and Lord Curzon, the Balfour Declaration would have been very different. He got his comeuppance, do you agree, during the debate on the Amritsar massacre in the early 1920s, when he had to wind up for the government against General Dyer, and he unleashed a torrent of anti-Semitism. So could you give us a little pen portrait about Edwin Montagu, please?
Edwin Montagu is one of the most pathetic figures in the cousinhood in the first half of the 20th century. He was, of course, a younger son of Samuel Montagu, born Montagu Samuel in Liverpool, Montague Samuel was a banker. He came to London. He changed his name from Montague Samuel to Samuel Montague. He was an extremely Orthodox Jew. He is one of only 4 Jewish MPs whom I know to have been Shomer Shabbos. He and his wife kept Shabbos when the House of Commons sat late on a Friday. She would light candles in the House of Commons. He was a fluent Yiddish speaker, and he was Liberal MP for Whitechapel from 1885 to 1900, when he was elevated to the peerage as the first Baron Swathling. We get a glimpse of the household in which over which he presided and in which his children were brought up through the writings of his rebel daughter, Lily Montague, who, of course, was a founder of the Liberal Jewish Synagogue. In fact, I think Lily Montague was the first woman to be, I use this word delicately, to be ordained as a licensed preacher in a synagogue in Britain, in the Liberal Jewish Synagogue, St. John's Wood. She gives a very critical portrait of her father, of the cloying, strictly disciplined family over which Samuel Montague presided. His eldest son, Louis Montague, inherited the title on his father's death. And incidentally, of course, Samuel Montague was founder of the Federation of Synagogues in 1887. And when Samuel Montague died, the presidency automatically, as it were, went to his son, Louis Montague. The reason for that was mainly because the Federation subsisted on Montague money. And of course, they wanted the money to continue. Louis Montague was a ferocious anti-Zionist who had signed an infamous letter in the Morning Post in 1919, the letter of the 10, denouncing the Jewish proletariat in East London as harbingers of Bolshevism and communism. Louis Montague was eventually forced out of the presidency of the Federation by a grassroots rebellion led by the upstart owner of public houses and racketeer, Maurice Harold Davis. Davis got the Federation Council to pass a resolution saying that any member of the council who wanted to could speak in Yiddish. Louis Montague couldn't speak Yiddish, so that was the end of his presidency, obviously. Edwin Montague was Louis Montague's brother, much in the same mould, but he enjoyed ill health throughout his life. He was a good pen pusher. He became secretary. He was a close friend of Lloyd George. It's not necessarily a compliment, of course. And we know now why was a close friend, or why Lloyd George was a close friend of his. Edwin Montague was Secretary of State for India in Lloyd George's wartime government. As such, he had a perfectly legitimate interest in protecting, shoring up relations between the British imperial power and its many, many millions of Muslim citizens. And he was genuinely worried about the impact that the Balfour Declaration might have on the Muslims in India. And of course, the Indian Empire then extended to what we would now call Pakistan and Bangladesh. It had an enormous Muslim population. But in addition to that, Edwin Montague was one of these Jews, I used the word earlier, paranoid and panicky, and he was one of the Jews who panicked. He wrote a pathetic letter to Lloyd George about Lloyd George's newfound interest in Zionism. I'm paraphrasing here, Richard, but Louis Montague said, you know, for ages we've been trying to get out of the ghetto, and you want to push us back in. unknown to Edwin Montagu. Edwin Montagu's wife, a society beauty called Venetia Stanley, was having an affair with Lloyd George. And here is where it gets interesting. And Venetia Stanley was not Jewish. She was McGuired under a quickie conversion and married Edwin Montagu. And on the morning of their chuppah, their marriage, she wrote her future husband, Edwin Montagu, an astonishing letter. I'm quoting it almost verbatim. She said, "Please remember, my dear Edwin, that I'm marrying you for your days, not for my nights." That's what she wrote. That's what she wrote. She slept around, as it were, and the daughter that this marriage allegedly produced was certainly not, Edwin Montagu was certainly not the father. He was, at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, he had booked a hotel room for him and his wife, Venetia Stanley, in Paris. But when they got to the hotel, or when they got to Paris, Edwin discovered that his wife, Venetia Stanley, had changed the hotel. And the reason she changed the hotel was so that they could occupy a suite with a connecting room to Lloyd George's bedroom. Well, you can read into that what you like. Richard, I had at Oxford, I was 2 years in college and then spent 4 years in digs. And the landlady was Welsh. She came from the North Wales village in which Lloyd George had grown up and where he's now buried. If any of you go to his burial site, you'll see a huge boulder over his grave, and this is to prevent him jumping out of the grave. So I once asked my landlady, I said, "Flo, did you know Lloyd George?" And she said, "Geoffrey, every girl in the village knew Lloyd George." Montagu enjoyed very bad health, and he died in, I think, one of the participants here can look him up on Wikipedia. I think
1924.
1924. Yes.
Yeah.
Cuckolded. He was a laughingstock, but it's absolutely right. He played a crucial role in altering the text of the Balfour Declaration. No question about that at all.
Do you think then that when he was howled down for being a Jew during the Amritsar massacre debates, that perhaps he might have felt that he was wrong about his status as an Englishman and a Jew?
You know, how do I know? He might have felt that he was wrong. I have to say about Amritsar, of course, it was the centenary last year, but the British general who ordered his troops to fire on the protesters in what became known as the Amritsar massacre was hailed in this country as a hero. A public purse was opened for him. Thousands of pounds were collected. He was called in the press the saviour of the Punjab. However much we may regret, however much David Cameron might have regretted, or Theresa May, I'm not sure who, would have regretted the Amritsar massacre now, it was not, in large sections of British society, it was not in the least regretted at the time. And it was General Dwyer, was it not? Or Dwyer, I think. He was a national hero.
Yeah, but it was the so-called imperialist and racist Winston Churchill who actually took over the reins from Montagu and wind up for the government and did achieve in getting Dyer cashiered out of India. Well,
you know, Dyer was what can one say? He was a trigger-happy soldier of the old school.
Yeah.
I've often felt that in the immediate post First World War period, there was a sea change in British attitude to its imperial responsibilities. I'm going to say something outrageous here. Had
Good.
the Amritsar massacre taken place at the time of the so-called Indian Mutiny, there wouldn't have been the same reaction. But something happened deep down in the psyche of British society.
Okay, I'm sure I've said enough now. So would anyone else like to raise a question before we give Geoffrey a well-deserved vote of thanks? There's David Diamond. Let's unmute you, David.
Hello, can you
Good
hear
evening.
me? Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes.
Good. Good evening. Thank you very much. That very stimulating. If you could answer questions. I used to read the Jewish Quarterly, which, as we know, was a great intellectual journal of the arts. Has now gone bankrupt, I think, a few years ago. Geoffrey, isn't it disgraceful that a so-called intellectual community such as ours can't even sustain one proper art-type literary journal? Jewish Chronicle, with respect, is broad spectrum. It's no answer to the depth of the Jewish Quarterly, certainly when painting, poetry, novels. And you are a professional academic. In your circles, are you aware of any plans, any hopes? Now we've got Jewish Chronicle, it seems on sound financial footing, of perhaps the Jewish Chronicle being revised. I find it very hard to believe that there aren't enough wealthy Jews who are intellectually inclined in our community who love the arts that can't get together a paper like Revive, the Jewish Quarterly.
I agree with you. It's a very sad situation. That there used to be a small but rich diversity of Jewish journals, quarterlies, annual publications devoted to Jewish culture and particularly Anglo-Jewish culture, and they have all fallen by the wayside. None of these ventures would ever have made a profit, and what one needs is a set of philanthropists of the old school who are prepared to put money in but aren't looking for anything in return. They'll just put money in and hope that some good is done. Now there are some philanthropists about, but now is not. I'm sorry to say, I don't think that now is the time when they can be propositioned, so to speak, over perhaps funding such a venture. It is very, very sad. However, there is another side to this story. When I was a student in the 1960s, Anglo-Jewish history and more generally Anglo-Jewish studies were really not taught beyond the borders of the universities of Oxford, Cambridge and London. Now, it is difficult to find a university that does not teach some branch of Jewish studies in some form or another. You may say, well, that's only because Jewish studies has had to reinvent itself as a branch of cultural studies, or dare I say it, feminist studies. Well, so be it. You know, history is a contracting subject in British universities, but it's also going in the same direction. It's embedding itself in other disciplines. So maybe that's a positive portent for the future.
Okay, well, we're down to 28 participants now, and I don't really want to leave without everyone who's here giving you a very well-deserved round of applause. So if everyone can unmute and show their appreciation.
This has been a journey. Thank you so much. This has been a journey of adventure for us all. I hope we can repeat it at some time.
Indeed.
And thank you and your colleagues for organising it.
And thank you very much for being such a sparkling guest. Thank you indeed.
Thank you.
Okay,
Bye.
good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers,
You're
Richard.
welcome.
Cheers. Thank you, Richard.
Yeah, I'll leave it on for a bit. I'll stay online in case anybody wants to ask me any questions.
Very interesting, Richard. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. It was really nice to have 32 people. I think that's pretty
You
good.
did
for a-
very well. You should be very, very proud of yourself, Rich.
Well, let's hope it's the first, well, of many, because it's not just during lockdown that it's useful to have this facility, but, you know, there are people who can't, on a winter's night, go out, they're housebound. I think it's a very good extra string to our bow.
I think in
We
doing
should
it
do
in
these Zoom
addition,
meetings in addition, yeah.
in addition, because I think there's many disabled people who may not be able
Yes.
to leave their homes, and I think it's just equal opportunities.
Yeah.
Well done, Richard.
Thank you. There's something
Thank
we'll
you very
definitely
much.
consider. I've had a few other speakers say they're interested in doing this on Zoom if we're still in lockdown. So that's Jeff Page for the Dreyfus talk and Ian Bloom for the talk on the Gordon riots. So
That could be interesting, Rich.
I hope
Hi,
we can
Daniel.
maintain
Hi
the
there. Just a quick
momentum. Yeah.
a quick thank you to Caroline. Thanks,
Indeed.
Caroline. I can see you're on mute, but thank you very much.
Absolutely. Caroline's done a sterling job. I'm really grateful.
Yeah, pleasure. I'm glad it went well.
Yeah, thanks very much. And maybe now other branches of the JHSE will do the same during lockdown. So
Absolutely no reason for them not to. Can work very well indeed.
yeah, all right. All right, well, I wish everybody well. And I think we've had quite a lot of intellectual inspiration from Geoffrey tonight. So it makes a change from watching TV, doesn't it?
Very much. Bye.
Okay,
Bye.
bye-bye, everyone. I'm going to
Bye-bye. Thank you.
leave now. Okay, thanks again, Caroline.
Not at
Bye.
all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.